This BYU Forum address with Jim Leach was given on February 24th, 2015.
Good morning. I'm pleased to welcome you here this morning for today's Forum Assembly. My name is Brent Webb, and President Worthen has asked me to conduct the Forum today. We're delighted to welcome to campus our distinguished guest, Mr. Jim Leach, former chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities and former congressman from Iowa. Mr. Jim Leach served as the 9th chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities before accepting an appointment as the inaugural University of Iowa chair in public affairs and visiting professor of law in the College of Law. Mr. Leach graduated with honors from Princeton, received an MA from the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, and did further graduate work at the London School of Economics. He has been awarded 13 honorary degrees, has received decorations from 2 foreign governments, and is the recipient of the Wayne Morse Integrity in Politics Award, the Adlai Stevenson Award from the United Nations Association, and the Edgar Wayburn Award from the Sierra Club, along with the Norman Borlaug Public Service Award and the Woodrow Wilson Medal from Princeton. Prior to his appointment as chair of the NEH, Mr. Leach was a professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton and lecturer and interim director of the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. His time in academia was preceded by 30 years as a member of the House of Representatives from Iowa, where he chaired the Banking and Financial Services Committee, the Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Mr. Leach has served on the International Advisory Committee of the Principal Financial Group, on the board of several public companies and nonprofit organizations, including the Century Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Kettering Foundation, ProPublica, and Common Cause, which for a short time he chaired. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations, and formerly served as a trustee of Princeton University. Would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Jim Leach?
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, in particular because I've just learned before coming in that the BYU Cougars are the national champions in rugby, a sport that I dearly love. Anyway, I would like to begin today's discussion with several personal observations. First, I bring greetings from my law school's distinguished Senior Associate Dean, Eric Anderson, who's a graduate of this fine university in its law school. Eric is one of the country's leading authorities on the conjunction of law and religion, and he's made a point of welcoming BYU students to our academic community. So my mission is to invite any of you interested in law as a profession or as a base for another profession to please feel free to contact Eric or me at any time in the future, and we'd welcome you in Iowa City. Iowa features a more gently rolling plain than is the hallmark of the West, but once served as the distant gateway to the majestic mountains and canyons of Utah, where so many Mormon families found refuge and opportunity. Indeed, Iowa City has named a road Mormon Trek to pay homage to the brief time in the mid-19th century when it stood both as the ending point of the first railroad that bridged the Mississippi River and the starting point for a courageous group of Mormons who debarked from coal-fired trains to pull carts loaded with all their worldly goods to a promised and promising land. A decade and a half ago, the leadership of the Mormon Church came to Iowa City to commemorate the journey in which many died along the way, and more than a few survivors arrived in Salt Lake with bloodied feet wrapped in rags. I will never forget the reading of poignant excerpts from diaries of those who risked so much and suffered so dearly to join earlier Mormon pioneers and the communities of common values they had established here in Utah. The second observation I'd like to make is that never has this country been more in need of the international leadership which many in this community have been raised to project. My intent this afternoon is to touch on the causes of contemporary public angst, dysfunctional politics, and the unprecedented challenge to world order that have arisen in the new millennium. My premise is that America cannot lead wisely unless we come to understand peoples and their variations far more deeply than has been reflected so far in this century. Greater understanding must begin with a sincere interest in studying other societies and what differentiates the wide variety of thinking and worshiping that exists around the globe. In this regard, one fundamental tradition that sets the Mormon Church apart is the depth of its commitment to missions abroad. These missions represent faith-inspired evangelism, but implicitly the missions are about learning as well as teaching. Foreign missions, after all, are like graduate-level immersions in unlike cultures. Not only are languages learned, but so are habits of the mind. American governance today, especially the elective side, needs leaders who understand and are empathetic to the concerns of others, leaders who have friends in far corners of the earth, leaders who seek to serve rather than exploit, leaders who earn respect for their values. Inspiration might be found in those who have served in the Peace Corps, in our armed forces, in nonprofit organizations like Doctors Without Borders, and faith-based groups such as Mennonite, Lutheran, and Catholic World Services, and of course, the many Mormons who have served so compassionately in missions abroad. At the risk of presumption, I must tell you that what I respect most about the Mormon involvement in the political life of our country is that so many who ascribe to the faith instinctively lean conservatively on domestic issues and progressively on international ones. Mormons bring a particularly deep perspective to their international advocacy because it is derived from coming to know up close ordinary citizens and their family challenges. One of the myths of our time is that diplomacy is exclusively a government-to-government dialogue. Actually, it is unelected people of goodwill who are more central to defining the tone of relations between states than public officials. Representatives of government understandably dwell on power and security issues, especially in a fractured world. Cultural engagement, by contrast, is more about advancing mutual understanding and relying on the power of the human spirit. Since there will always be disagreements between people and countries, the challenge is to see that disputes, big and small, are resolved in civil rather than violent ways. Whether violence is an integral part of the human condition or a learned response is a matter of conjecture. But nonviolence is almost certainly a practice that must be learned. And the most effective form of social education is human contact, where greater understanding is mutually sought. It is the humanization rather than demonization of individuals from different societies, particularly those who are culturally more dissimilar or politically and economically most challenging, that is so critical if nonviolent approaches to problem solving are to be institutionalized. Without shared learning and handshakes of understanding, there can be no more than minimal trust, minimal security for family and nation. If people are to develop mutual respect, values must be brought to bear on a human scale. And these values are often best understood and reflected outside of political frameworks. Government, after all, is a part of culture, not vice versa. Politics of the moment may be fleeting. Culture, on the other hand, is deeply embedded, slow to change. The bottom line case for international cultural engagement is a risk management one. The obligation to help those in need and the necessity to help fellow citizens understand more deeply the world in which we live, and as a consequence, assist society at large in developing the wisdom, policies, and tools to avoid the apocalypse. The only credible methodology to secure and ennoble life on the planet is to build habits and techniques of conflict resolution that do not involve recourse to violence at every level of social interaction. This can only occur if there is instilled in peoples around the earth a sense of common destiny, of shared community, of appreciation for the core importance of loving or at least respecting thy neighbor instead of hating what makes him different. Accordingly, stewards of national power, and in a democracy, that means all of us have no choice except to strive to appreciate more fully the human condition. Livelihoods and life itself demand attention to wide horizons. As important as controversies of the day, politics of the moment may be, they are generally surface concerns. To understand problems on the surface, it's necessary to know the depths below, the history and culture of one's own society, and that of others, even the most distant. What is needed in a world of flux is a new understanding of the basics in education. Traditionally, the basics are about the 3 R's, which in my home state are sometimes understood to be reading, writing, and wrestling. But however defined, they're critical. Nonetheless, they're insufficient. What are also needed are studies that provide perspective on our times and foster citizen understanding of other cultures as well as our own communities. To understand and compete in today's market of goods and ideas, we need a 4th R, what for lack of a precise monitor might be described as reality, which includes relevant knowledge of the world and its people near and far. As individuals, each of us tries to make sense of our own odysseys through life. Our universe is small in relation not only to the solar system, but the communities in which we live. But wherever we might be, we are affected by global events, whether related to the challenges of national security or the global hiring hall. In this insecure political and economic environment, a deeper comprehension of the 4th R, reality, has never been more important. How can we compete in our own markets if we don't understand our own culture and its enormous variety of subcultures, or abroad if we don't understand foreign languages, histories, and traditions? How can we understand our own era and the place of our own values if we don't study other faith systems, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and the relationship of diverse religions to the Old and New Testaments? How can we contain prejudice and counter forces of hatred if we don't come to know more about each other? How can we undergird our civic institutions and precipitate sound public policy if we don't understand the rights and responsibilities of citizenship? Several years ago, in the wake of a talk I gave at Georgetown University, a visiting student from Egypt asked me a question I'd never encountered. What, he queried, did I think was the most important subject a college student should study? I hesitated for a moment and then simply asked him how he would answer. Unhesitant, he replied, "Of course, it is comparative religion." I then asked why, and he responded, "Unless we understand each other, we will never get along." The profoundness of his response made me think of a little notice speech given in Iowa a half-century ago. This audience may recall that in 1954, Winston Churchill gave a famous talk at a small college in Fulton, Missouri, where he coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the oppressive hegemony the Soviet Union imposed on countries of Eastern Europe in the wake of World War II. A decade later, the great British historian Arnold Toynbee gave a speech at another small Midwestern college, Grinnell, where he hoped to make a deeper impact with a different kind of message. He chose the moment to warn the Soviets that their notion of class warfare and Marxist economic determinism held no historical justification. At the same time, he cautioned our country, which was then in the thralls of a seminal civil rights movement, that the divisions in the world that were most likely to lead to war in the foreseeable future had little to do with racial discord. Instead, he predicted that America could peacefully mend its eternal ways, but noted that the great conflicts to come would more likely be rooted in religious rather than economic or racial differences. Toynbee's speech was either unnoted or dismissed in Moscow. It received little attention here, even in the state where it was delivered, because it seemed out of touch with the times. We, after all, were deeply challenged in the mid-1960s by the ramifications of 2 centuries of failure to implement our revolutionary commitment to equality of rights for people of African ancestry. Nevertheless, relative to many countries, America had come a long way in advancing greater respect between various faith systems. Hence, we had only distant memories and limited grasp for the religious intolerance that was part of our own country's past, as well as that of various societies from which most of our forebears had come. Yet, as we have seen in recent events, disdain for other faith systems characterizes many parts of the world. History has a circular quality. It tends to repeat, sometimes rewind. Wisdom, by contrast, is linear. Smart people, parents tell their children, learn from their own mistakes. A really smart person, a corollary might suggest, learns from the mistakes of others. And a sage gleans great truths from the wise as well as mistaken steps of those who came before. Every circumstance is, of course, different than any other. We don't ever walk in exactly the same way in the same physical or social environment. People and situations change. Hence, it's important to think imaginatively as well as pragmatically and historically. There are many ways to stimulate the imagination, from reading literature to studying and creating art. But the linchpins that most often tie other studies together are history and storytelling, oral and written. No discipline outside the humanities more effectively allow us to put on the shoes of others in past ages and different contemporary circumstances. St. Paul once suggested that we all look through a glass darkly. Metaphorically, Paul may have made the ultimate case for humility. While faith may be absolute, Paul suggests that man simply doesn't have the capacity to know the will of God or apply perfectly the wisdom of his apostles on earth. An analogous lack of certitude should be applied to history. There can be clarity about certain historical facts, like names and dates, but the whys and wherefores of events can be elusive. It is no accident that history can be more controversial than current events. Nonetheless, despite the fog that always hovers over memory, it is clear that the deeper our understanding of the past, the greater our capacity to cope with the present and mold the future. History is strewn with intolerant acts rooted in religious differences. The Holocaust, for instance, is without question the greatest sin mankind ever perpetuated on itself. Yet, in its aftermath, have created a special tie between America and Israel. But to understand the Middle East, we must also recognize that Muslims note they weren't complicit in the Holocaust. Accordingly, Palestinians argue that they deserve to be recognized as holding legitimate historical claims on parts of the Holy Land. Unfortunately, as in many human relations, advocates tend to weaken their own positions when they employ uncivil tactics, terrorism being an extreme example. Some, like former Iranian President Mohammad Ahmadinejad, even ignite discord by denying history itself and suggesting that the Holocaust simply did not take place. Only demagogues like Ahmadinejad fear the liberal arts. Like would-be thought controllers before him, he purged all humanities courses from any content not approved by censors. The liberal arts are anathema to tyrants precisely because they're specifically intended to liberate the mind, which is harder to incarcerate than the body. Yet the will of a people interested in exploring ideas, self-governance, and self-expression cannot forever be held in check. It was, in the end, the singular leadership of a shipyard electrician in Poland, a poet, playwright in Czechoslovakia, a pope in Rome, and poorly armed tribesmen in Afghanistan who overthrew the hegemony of a totalitarian state. And it was a generation of young activists demanding dignity and seeking opportunity who sparked the civil rights movement in America and Arab Spring. The history of our country is one of assimilation and expansion of pluralism in culture as well as law. But there can from time to time be a kind of groupthink in politics that magnifies institutional intransigence. Care has to be taken to recognize that seldom is there only one proper path determinable by one individual, one political party, or one ideological movement. Whether a person knows a great deal or very little, Caution should be taken about being certain of very much. To know a lot may be a preferable condition to knowing little, but the best and the brightest are not immune from great mistakes. Imperfect judgment characterizes the human condition, and that's why humility is such a valued character trait, and why civility is such an important part of an interconnected world polity. If all men are created equal, it inextricably follows that public officials must respect and factor into decision-making the views and like experiences of all their fellow citizens. Unfortunately, at issue increasingly is the question of conflicted loyalties. Is loyalty to a political party more important than loyalty to the country? Is loyalty to a fundraising elite more important than concern for the common good? The public has one answer. A critical reason approval ratings for institutions in Washington are so low is that politicians act as if they have another. In governance, process is our most important product. We used to instinctively treasure our democratic processes and trumpet them as models for the world. Today, many around the globe see us as running through a rough patch. In exasperation, or more than a little anger, American citizens find themselves increasingly using the adjective dysfunctional to describe congressional decision-making. We have had more difficult times in our history. Political issues were far more irreconcilable, for instance, in the decade before the Civil War. Nonetheless, seldom has it been more important for individuals in the public arena to appeal to the better angels of human nature. Whether the issues are social or economic, domestic or international, the temptation to appeal to the dark instincts must be avoided. The stakes are simply too high. The health of nations is directly related to the temperance of statecraft, to whether public officials inspire hope or manipulate fear. No founder, after all, ever suggested that dysfunctional governance was a worthy goal. Yet it is no mystery why gridlock exists today, nor is it a mystery why it matters. Public angst is simply deeply understandable. We have been immersed in our two longest and most debilitating wars, an aspect of which is the ease to which decisions were made to go to war and the unprecedented difficulty that is developed in bringing them to an end. When religion is mixed up with nationalism and terrorist tactics are employed capriciously by groups that do not form a formal government, no individual on one or both sides may be in a position to negotiate for peace or accept compromise. Incautiously, we have entered a group of civil wars that may carry multi-generational consequences for the United States as well as most countries in the Middle East and Central Asia. Compounding the international turmoil that has set in, we have witnessed an avoidable, man-made recession and now find ourselves with high unemployment and tepid growth. Public debt has mushroomed and disparities in income grown. These circumstances have been manipulated by influence wielders who gradually, over the past generation, have exacerbated divisive trends in American politics. Now, rather suddenly, matters of degree have become a matter of kind. Polarization is the order of the day. To elaborate on the new politics of the American Republic, I developed a series of what I call 2-minute courses in democratic governance when I left Congress for a teaching career. And I want to mention just 4 of these courses. The first I call Political Science 101. It has a mathematical dimension. Over the past generation, America has been approximately 1/3 Democratic, 1/3 Republican, and 1/3 no party. Half of a third is a 1/6. So 1/6 of America controls each of the 2 major parties. But in primaries, where the real weaknesses in our democracies resides, at most 1 in 4 eligible voters participate in legislative races, and often only 1 in 8 or even less. Accordingly, if one multiplies 1/4 times 1/6, it becomes evident that in a legislative primary, with participation rates larger than average, 1/24 of the electorate controls the choice of nominees. In caucus states, it can be even less than that. Well, who is this 1/24? In the Democratic Party, it is rather liberal, with consistent leadership coming from teachers, academics, and union members. In the Republican Party, it's rather conservative, with the philosophical term undergoing substantial change over the past generation. When I entered politics, conservatism was of a Goldwater bent, i.e., concern for military preparedness and opposition to high taxes and large social expenditures. But Goldwater's brand of individual rights conservatism was pro-choice and pro-gay rights, views which would make him a liberal Republican outlier today. In recent years, the activism in the Republican Party has become more of a social conservative nature, i.e. pro-life, anti-gay rights, anti-UN, with an infusion of global warming deniers. In addition, there's been a remarkable increase in the last 7 years of libertarians who often, but not always, are pro-choice, pro-hemp, anti-Fed, and less inclined to military options than either old-fashioned conservatives or liberals. What these figures mean is that the largest group that is suddenly underrepresented in Congress and increasingly state legislative chambers is the center-left and center-right, which traditionally, although perhaps not now, is the largest segment of the electorate. Political Science 102 is a course about which everyone knows half, but many haven't thought about the other half. The first half relates to presidential elections. It's generally understood that a Democratic candidate in a primary can be expected to attempt to appeal to the liberal voter and a Republican vice versa. Once nominated, however, both can be expected to scoot a bit to the center to attempt to attract the undecided and philosophically more moderate. But in congressional races, where 85% or more of all seats are safe for one party or the other, the first phenomenon, the candidate effort to appeal to the left as a Democrat and right as a Republican, also exists in a primary setting. But there is no scoot to the center in the general election or moderating in Congress, because if such a movement occurs, a candidate or elected representative can expect a stiff primary opponent with significant organization and fundraising capacity to emerge. It is now primaries rather than the general election where many incumbents are most vulnerable. Compromise may have once been the art of politics, but intransigence is a new art of political survival. If a politician in today's environment chooses to compromise on an issue, that politician becomes vulnerable to a primary challenge. Activists will insist that a real liberal or real conservative represent their preferred party and see to it that significant campaign resources will be made available to promote ideological purity. I have a course called Physics 101. Some of you have heard of Sir Isaac Newton. He once set forth 3 laws of nature, the third of which was that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. One day on the House floor, I discovered as a pun a 4th Newtonian law. Watching the then Speaker of the House deliver a blistering critique of the opposition and then watching the Democratic reaction, it dawned on me that in social chemistry, unlike natural physics, reaction tended to be greater than action. I initially considered this was a law of politics, but I soon realized it also applied to relations between people in general and countries at large. If, for instance, someone called someone else in this room a bum, the chances are not insignificant that an escalated response of one kind or another would result. Likewise, if a leader calls another country evil, it'd be no surprise if an escalation of verbiage and possibly actions would occur on the other side. Physics 102. Euclidean geometry assumes that parallel lines never meet and affirms that things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. The Newtonian precept that action equals reaction has had similar standing in science as Euclid's law about things equal to the same thing being equal to each other has had with mathematicians. But when Einstein suggested that space is curved, and when Val Fitch, the Nobel laureate physicist who passed away several weeks ago, proved that there was far less antimatter than matter in space, he upended a Newtonian scientific consensus that matter and antimatter involve paired reactions. The logical opinions of earthly geometry and physics have thus become challenged by the imagination-stretching prospect that there may be a non-Newtonian physics applicable to space. An analogous thought challenge emerged over a century ago when alternative non-Euclidean geometries were developed by two European mathematicians, a German Riemann and a Russian Lobachevsky. The first was premised on the assumption that parallel lines met once, and the second assumed they met twice. Only later, when Euclid's geometry was observed not to fit space, did scientists find relevance to mathematical models that seemed intuitively irrational. Well, why bother to question great truths? The analogies are what is revealing. The math of politics simply has to be tempered by the physics of statesmanship. If Einstein is correct that splitting the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking, the political meaning of what science and technology have wrought is incontrovertible. Vulnerability is now the state of man everywhere. The case for greater public temperance has never been greater. Words are important. Thomas Jefferson in the 1800 election hired a journalist who labeled John Adams a hermaphrodite. By the way, I didn't know the meaning of that until I had to look it up, but I know it isn't a compliment. Our last president, George W. Bush, was called a fascist, and our current president has been termed a fascist and a communist, often by the same people at the same time. Well, what's the matter with a bit of hyperbole? And the answer is plenty. In Adams' case, the pejorative description was intended as a character slur. In the case of both Bush and Obama, the criticism is more dangerous because the words fascist and communist have warring implications. 400,000 American patriots lost their lives defeating fascism. Tens of thousands fell, and trillions of dollars were spent holding communism at bay. As for the truly irrational birther claim that President Obama was not born in Hawaii, or does not love the country he leads, as the former mayor of New York has recently contended, at issue becomes respect for the presidency and perhaps even the constitutional legitimacy of the president himself. It's no accident that social splintering is so severe and that the political will to make government work is so lacking. When I was in college, a fashionable set of books to read was the Alexander Quartet by the British author Lawrence Durrell. Durrell wrote 4 novels, each titled with an individual's name, set in the years between World War I and II in Alexandria, Egypt. Each book was about the same rather minor happenings in an exotically vibrant city. One might wonder why read about the same events 4 different times. It ends up that all 4 stories are dramatically different, and the literary moral is that each participant witnessed happenings of the day in a different way, and that to get a sense for reality, it's helpful to see things from a variety of perspectives. That is why 2 people in a courtroom may testify truthfully, but quite differently to the same events. It is why it may be helpful at a dinner table, in a legislature, and in international relations to listen to what others think and say. In Western civilization's most prophetic poem, The Second Coming, William Butler Yeats observed that the center cannot hold when the best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeats was reacting to the seemingly senseless carnage of World War I trench warfare. But the chaos of modernity has produced a crisis of perspective as well as values that give his words contemporary relevance. I stray into the politics of politics because political gridlock poses a challenge to national security, just as it does to domestic tranquility, and because the institutional shock of our times is the undercutting of our governance ethic by the principal balancing institution in our constitutional system, the Supreme Court. In the most irresponsible decision since the 1857 Dred Scott ruling held that a class of human being, those of color, could be bought and treated as property, the court and Citizens United determined that a class of property, that is corporations, had the rights of human beings and could invest directly in politics. The court's grant of massive new power to corporations changes the chemistry of governmental decision-making. Based on the frail assumption that corporations are individuals and that money is speech, with its use therefore protected by the First Amendment, Citizens United genetically alters our democratic DNA, pushing American politics in an oligarchic, corporatist direction. The dilemma of today's politics is that while America has an abundance of leadership in commerce, science, the arts, and every facet of the economy, the political system is hamstrung by ideological cleavages. President Eisenhower warned years ago of a military-industrial complex. Today, my worry is more about the rise of a political ideological complex. Ideologues use politicians as pawns, while politicians use ideologues, especially those with deep pockets, as enablers of personal ambition. This reinforcing set of mutual interests has little to do with the common good and much to do with the breakdown in civility in public life. For many, concern for civility seems either unimportant or sanctimonious. Actually, civility is an enduring virtue of civilized society through the ages. At issue is how individuals interrelate in community and how societies make decisions that can affect their place in relation to all others. Civility is not simply or principally about manners. It doesn't mean that spirited advocacy is to be avoided. Indeed, argumentation is a social good. Without argumentation, there's a tendency to dogmatism, even tyranny. What civility does require is a willingness to consider respectfully the views of others, with an understanding that we're all connected and rely on each other. Uncivil speech dispirits the soul of society. Nevertheless, more insidious than the pervasive public incivility of many modern campaigns is the polite, private incivility that is common on Capitol Hill. The electoral process is more than what happens on Election Day. It's also about what happens between elections. To paraphrase Clausewitz, lawmaking is the continuation of politics in another form. Electoral politics never stops. It is just interrupted every year or two to count ballots. Civility and politeness are not synonymous. Indeed, in the quarters of the Capitol complex, polite words are sometimes more problematic than raucous ones. Example: every day, legislators walk from their offices to the forums, which are the legislative chamber of the House and the Senate. And along the way, there are well-dressed, fine gentlemen and gentlelady, termed lobbyists. And the typical conversation goes something like this. Congressman, as you know, we maxed out for you in the last election. We need you tomorrow. Our allies sure hope to be able to be more than match that support in this fall. But please understand that when this bill comes up tomorrow, we would sure appreciate your support. And by the way, how are your wife and kids? Politely stated, but there is no reference to the common good. Instead, coercively implied is an ongoing, quasi-contractual relationship between the interest group and a public official. These implicit uncivil contracts can be coercive, even if never discussed, because corporate power can so easily reward a candidate or inflict political retribution. On the assumption, for instance, that politicians have an instinct for political survival, a key component of which is a desire to raise campaign revenues and suppress opponent treasuries, why in a corporatist political system would a politician want to stand up to the drug companies or gambling interests or investment banks if corporate monies can quickly be shoveled into the political trenches? Finally, let me conclude with an observation about another element of American society that's highly competitive, that being sports. When I first entered politics, I used to make one-to-one analogies between sports and politics. As time went on, these analogies seemed to break down. Despite the publicized misbehavior of a few, sports has a far higher competitive ethic than politics. This may be the case because most sports have referees, whereas politics have none. It also relates to coaches who teach athletes how to work together and respect their opponents. In politics, the analog to coaches are campaign advisors. There is hardly a campaign advisor in the country who doesn't urge a candidate in a close election to raise mountains of revenues from any source and to go negative. But how do people and political parties come together after so much accentuation of the negative? In most cases, and I acknowledge there can be exceptions, the temper and the integrity of the political discourse is more important than the precise outcome of an issue, even an election. Soldiers learn that working as a unit increases the chance of prevailing in combat. Athletes learn that team effort trumps individual stardom. Should not the common good in politics come before self-interest? Thank you.
This BYU Forum address with Jim Leach was given on February 24th, 2015.